Okay, welcome council, staff, excuse me, and general public to our public meeting of August 4th, 2020. I'll hand it over to Mrs. Haley, if you would, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm just going to share my screen so we can get started. Just be a moment, please. Okay, so welcome everyone to our public meeting this evening. We have some rules of engagement for you. For members of the public that are participating by Zoom or by phone, we will be permitted to speak after my presentation. Prior to speaking, please state your name and your address for the record. To make a comment, please use the raise hand function and the chair will call on you. If you have registered to participate in the meeting by phone to speak to a particular or to this application, you will be asked if you would like to comment on the application after the presentation. We have had many people interested in speaking this evening, so we ask that you keep your comments to 5 minutes or less, simply to allow a variety of people to speak. So we'll just get started by reading the required information under Section 34 of the Planning Act. Any person may attend this hearing and or make written or verbal representation, either in support of or in opposition to the proposed zoning amendment. If a person or public body does not make oral or written submissions at this hearing for the zoning amendment, before the zoning amendment is decided upon, the person or public body is not entitled to appeal the decision of the council of the Township of South Glengarry to the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal, also known as LPAT. If a person or public body does not make oral submissions at a hearing or make written submissions to the Township of South Glengarry before the zoning amendment is decided upon, the person or public body may not be added as a party to the hearing of an appeal before LPAT unless, in the opinion of the tribunal, there are reasonable grounds to do so. So I'd like to get started by describing the property. So the property is located in the south part of Lot H, Concession 1, in the geographic township of Charlottenburg, now in South Glengarry, also known as 20170 County Road 2. This is a key map of the property. You can see County Road 2 and the St. Lawrence River here, and over to the right of my mouse to the east would be the village of Lancaster. We also have an aerial view of the subject property. The property is highlighted in light blue. You can see there's an existing structure here, which is currently known as the Smoking Bull, formerly known as Lancaster Inn, then with manicured lawn down the side, which I'll speak to a little later. So the property is approximately 21 acres and is currently developed, containing a commercial structure currently occupied by the Smoking Bull restaurant with a second floor residential unit. The subject property also contains a manicured lawn with several boat slips. The purpose of this amendment is to rezone the subject area of the property from provincially significant wetland and floodplain holding to provincially significant wetland and open space to permit the use of the campground. The Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, which is now known as MNRF, reevaluated the PSW, in which resulted in a wetland boundary adjustment, therefore reducing the area of the subject property previously zoned as PSW. This area is proposed to be zoned open space to accommodate a 25-lot campground. The remainder of the property will remain in the provincially significant wetland zone. The township received a zoning amendment application on May 12, 2020. The complete submission contained a zoning amendment application, planning rationale, a site plan of the proposed campground, an environmental impact study, a topographical survey, and a letter from the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry speaking to the realigned wetland. On May 1st, 2018, the MNRF notified the property owner that the wetland had been evaluated and an adjustment was made, resulting in the Charlottenburg Marsh wetland being reduced by 2.9 acres. The boundary adjustment follows the lawn area on the subject property and reflects the limit of the proposed zoning amendment for the campground use. So I'd like to go back to the slide that shows the aerial image at this time, just to explain this further. So you can see here, all this area is manicured lawn, And this area would be more brushland, marshy lands. Where the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry realigned the wetland boundary is they reduced it to follow this area that's now manicured, meaning that this area can now be developed. And the proposed development this evening that we're dealing with is the proposed 25 lot campground. So there are no permanent buildings or structures proposed as part of the campground. Each individual campsite will be serviced with hydro and water connections. And this is basically a site plan showing the proposed development. I know this is very difficult to read on the screen. At the top where my mouse is where the existing restaurant. So this would be the proposed 25 lot campground following that manicured lawn boundary. This area in the speckled or the hatching is the proposed gravel driveway, and then each parking area for the proposed individual campsites. The subject property is currently designated commercial district in the official plan and PSW, of course, in the western portion of the property. And the proposed zoning or this proposed zoning amendment conforms to the official plan. The Raisin Region Conservation Authority and the United Counties of Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry have been circulated on this application. The reason why the United Counties is circulated is because this property fronts on County Road 2. The Raisin Region Conservation Authority was circulated for a few reasons. One, they are the owner of the property to the west known as Cooper's Marsh. They are also required to be circulated when we have development proposed within 120 meters of wetland, as well as when it's in proximity to the St. Lawrence River. The RSCA has reviewed the application. They've also reviewed the environmental impact statement, and they have requested a few amendments to this study, which are currently being addressed. This zoning amendment application will be subject to a decision of council. A staff report, including a recommendation, will be brought to council for a decision in the near future. If this amendment is approved by our council, the proposed campground will be subject to a process called site plan control. And basically what that is it's a land use planning process under the Ontario Planning Act that really controls the development of the site, the exact location of the individual campgrounds, where the driveway is going to be, how the property is going to be graded, drained, and accessed, as well as the services that will be provided to sites. All public comments must be received by Friday, August 21st, 2020 at 4 p.m. This will allow us to review all the comments in detail and consider the comments accordingly before we make any recommendations to council to either approve or refuse the application. At this time, I would like to turn this over to FO10 Planning, which is a planning firm that has been retained by the property owner, and they will provide more details about the proposed zoning amendment.
Good evening and thank you. First of all, can everyone hear me okay? Yes, I'm seeing nods, great. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So is there a PowerPoint presentation now in front of you? Perfect. Okay, thank you so much. And good evening, members of staff, council, and members of the public. My name is Jennifer Wood. I'm a land use planner with FO10 Planning and Design. And I'm here this evening presenting this application for zoning bylaw amendment on behalf of the applicant, Weaving Baskets Group, for the proposed rezoning at 2170 County Road 2. I am sharing a PowerPoint presentation, so I appreciate there's some folks who may be attending by telephone. So I'm going to try to really describe each slide in terms of its content and imagery as best as possible. So I won't spend too long on the site description and context because staff did a great job of that already, but the site is located on the south side of County Road 2. It's just west and south of Lancaster, it's about 21 acres in size. The site is currently developed with a few uses. As staff already noted, there is a restaurant located at the north end of the property, close to County Road 2. There's also an existing driveway, laneway, gravel that provides access to a few existing boat slips. And then the balance of the property is for the most part vacant, undeveloped land. And as staff noted, there's a very visual delineation between where the wet marshland area ends and where sort of this mowed, manicured area begins. And I'll get into more detail about the proposed design, but that's where the proposed campsites will be located. In terms of the surrounding context, to the east is a marina, which includes in-water docking as well as on-land boat storage, both indoor and outdoor. To the south is the St. Lawrence River. To the west is Cooper Marsh Conservation Area, and to the north are primarily rural and agricultural uses. So again, I won't linger on this too long because staff did a great job describing this, but just a brief history. A significant portion of the property was previously identified and continues to be identified as provincially significant wetland. So the green hatch patterned area shows the previous PSW delineation, and it effectively includes the entire property with the exception of the existing developed areas. So the restaurant and the existing driveway, parking and docking facilities. And in May 2018, Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry confirmed a boundary change to that PSW known as Cooper Marsh Conservation Area. And the bottom image, similar to what you've already seen, the blue area shows the revised PSW boundary. This came directly from a letter from MNRF. So that new boundary is essentially straddling where the marshy wetland area ends and the manicured mowed lawn begins. And so in light of the PSW boundary change, and given that the lands are designated for commercial use, which I'll touch on in a moment, the owner wanted to proceed with plans that would balance a desire to increase opportunities for recreation and access to the water, also with mitigating potential negative impacts on the adjacent provincially significant wetland. And so the plan for the vacant mowed portion of the property is to create and establish a passive recreational use, which includes 25 new campsites for tent and trailer overnight stays. And so this image, I think hopefully is a little bit clearer. We've put together something a little bit more conceptual and added some color for clarity. So essentially there's an existing gravel road, which you can see in this dark gray color, that comes in off County Road 2, wraps the property and provides access to a number of existing docking, slips, and surface parking. So there's a point where we're proposing that there be a fork in this gravel road and essentially a new finger that would come off. That would be the yellow area. So this gravel road would continue providing access to each individual campsite and a small surface parking space for each site. And then the orange area kind of shows the overall extent of the campground area. And within that area, there are sort of smaller, darker orange boxes that illustrate the paths that would be for each of these sites. As staff noted there's no proposed structures or buildings as part of this proposal. There would be essentially a gravel pad as well as water and hydro connection for each site. Sewage would be pumped from each site and taken to an MOE, a Ministry of Environment approved septic system. So there won't be any septic treatment occurring directly at any of these campsites. Now, an environmental impact study, or EIS, is required whenever you propose development or site alteration within 120 meters of provincially significant wetlands. So any site works, any alteration, just by virtue of this property's proximity to the PSW, triggers the need for an EIS. And so Beacon Environmental was retained to prepare an environmental impact study, which includes an impact assessment as well as mitigation measures. Now, this is a very comprehensive report, highly detailed. It outlines the results of the various field investigations and background report review that was done. But I did want to take a moment to highlight the recommended mitigation measures, because I think that will directly feed into the planning application that is before you, as well as future site plan application. The first mitigation measure, which I have listed here, is essentially built into and inherent to the design of the proposal, in that no in-water structures are proposed and there's no proposed development or site alteration to the PSW. And that in and of itself is a mitigation measure. As well, vegetation removal and disturbance needs to occur outside of peak bird nesting period. And so this is the period generally between mid-April and mid-July, and no vegetation clearing or disturbance of nesting bird habitat should be occurring within this window, this 3-month window. The third mitigation piece, which I think is really critical here, as I said, there's no proposed structures or buildings. So that in and of itself will really mitigate potential impacts, but there will be an increase in human activity directly adjacent to a provincially significant wetland. And so what we have been discussing and what has been a recommendation of this EIS is educational signage for campsite users. So this would involve, and I think, we are at the zoning stage, which is really establishing principle of development. And I think a lot of these details will come out of a future site plan application, as well as the permit that's required from the Conservation Authority. But we are looking and working with the Conservation Authority on installing signage and potentially even providing, some sort of handout or literature to inform users. First of all, that you are directly abutting a provincially significant wetland. Folks might not actually be aware of that, as well as the St. Lawrence River, and what are appropriate and improved activities that can occur on these campsites. And so the details of that, whether that be, what activities are okay, are there sort of rules around, how you obtain firewood, proper disposal of waste from your trailers, concerns around littering, even access restrictions to the provincial significant wetland are all elements that would be looked at through this on-site signage and potential literature that's provided to users of the campground. And then the final piece is erosion and sediment control. This mostly has to do with the construction phase, so grading and grubbing have the potential to move sediment into the adjacent PSW and St. Lawrence River. And these interactions can be mitigated through best practice and through mitigative measures that are discussed in the EIS and would be implemented through the site plan control process. And so, subject to the recommended mitigation measures that are discussed, the EIS essentially concludes that the proposed campsites should have no negative impacts on the adjacent natural heritage feature. And then I would just finally note to this slide that notwithstanding the zoning bylaw amendment before you, as well as a future site plan application, any site work, introducing these pads and the new gravel laneway will require a permit from the Conservation Authority. I'll just briefly touch on the applicable policy framework applicable to this site. This is an image of an excerpt from the official plan. It's sort of difficult to make out a little bit, but essentially the property is designated commercial district. This property, as well as a number of other properties to the east of here. And this designation permits a full range of uses, including retail, service commercial, automotive, recreational and resort commercial, personal service, and residential. And so the proposed campground use is probably one of the most passive and least intensive commercial uses that are contemplated in the commercial district designation. A portion of the property is also designated provincially significant wetland, essentially reflecting the previous wetland boundary. Now that boundary has now changed, which means the designation boundary has also changed. The official plan does contain interpretation policies which allow for what we call technical adjustments to land use designations, and more specifically, the OP allows for adjustments to wetland boundaries when those adjustments have been approved by the ministry, which has already occurred. This is the zoning that currently applies to the site. There are 3 zones. The restaurant to the north is within the highway commercial zone. The majority of the property is currently zoned provincially significant wetland, and then there's a small portion that's zoned floodplain. And of course, the proposed campground use is not permitted, which is why we're proposing a zoning bylaw amendment. And so essentially, we're proposing to convert the portion of the property that was zoned PSW that's been removed from the designation by MNRF to a site-specific open space zone, and that's outlined in white. The open space zone is the typical zoning that we would apply to a campground use. However, the open space zone permits actually a very wide variety and range of uses. In addition to the campground use, it allows community centers, arenas, fairgrounds, golf courses, conservation uses, heritage and historical sites, public parks, recreational uses, and accessory buildings. Now, it is not the intent of the applicant to permit any of those more intensive open space uses, and so we're proposing a site-specific open space zone that would only permit a campground use and would effectively preclude all of those more intensive uses that we feel would be inappropriate to be directly adjacent to the provincially significant wetland. The rezoning would also recognize relief needed in the 30-meter wetland setback to allow site alteration, which includes the new gravel driveway and campsite pads. This relief is considered appropriate based on implementing the mitigation measures recommended in the environmental impact study. So just to summarize, it's my opinion that this proposed rezoning represents good land use planning. It's consistent with the general intent of the official plan as an appropriate form of development within the district commercial designation. Impacts on the adjacent wetlands will be mitigated subject to the recommendations of the EIS. And the proposed use is compatible given the context of the surrounding area. That concludes my presentation. I'm happy to assist staff with responding to any questions or comments from council or members of the public. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Joanne, did you have anything further to add before I go to questions?
No, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any comments or questions from members of council? Not seeing none at this point, I'll go to the general public. Madam Clerk, is there anybody from the public that has comments or questions?
Yes, through you, Mr. Mayor, Elaine Kennedy has her hand.
Councillor Jaworski did have her hand up, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Jaworski, then we'll go to the public.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Mayor, although I would have been patient to wait, but thank you, Deputy Mayor Warden, for pointing it out. My question is about when it comes to campgrounds, is there guidance in terms of size of, for example, like with houses, we have front yard setback, side yard setback, lot coverage. Are there similar guidelines when it comes to campgrounds?
I can answer that, Mr. Mayor. So currently our zoning bylaw would not provide guidelines to the effect that would be similar to, let's say, single family dwellings. However, we would work with the, if the zoning amendment is approved, we would work with the property owner to come up with sites that meet the market needs and demands to accommodate a variety of size of campgrounds, or excuse me, campers. And that would be reflected in the site plan and be part of the site plan control approvals. So you'd be looking at access, making sure that the trailers can back up, enter and exit the sites accordingly. Make sure they're large enough to accommodate the longest trailer and the shortest trailer. Even tents were mentioned earlier in the presentation. So all of that would be reviewed.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we do have a question from someone in the general public. Elaine Kennedy, are you on? You can take off your mute, please.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Go ahead, Elaine.
Okay, thank you. I have a submission that I would like to read to you. Apologize for no visual. I do not have a camera on my monitor. I will read that to you, and then I have a couple of questions afterwards. I am secretary to the board of directors of the Cooper Marsh Conservators, a volunteer community-based group. Our mandate is to protect, conserve, educate, and restore Cooper Marsh, a Class 1 provincially significant wetland, as has been described. We have raised and spent almost $700,000 to fulfill our mandate. The township of South Glengarry continues to contribute significantly to our work. The area that is being discussed tonight abuts the East Marsh section of Cooper Marsh, which is one of the 3 sections of Cooper Marsh. The other 2 are the Main Marsh and the West Marsh. The East Marsh is one of the least visited areas of Cooper Marsh and is a site where threatened and uncommon wetland birds breed, such as the least bittern and the sandhill crane. The Conservators are very concerned about the change in zoning from floodplain to open space, and in order to fulfill our mandate, we would like to propose some conditions on the bylaw amendment if it is approved, or from what I've just learned tonight on the site plan. Since the tranquility of the East Marsh, because of its distance from the main entrance, plays an important role in its attraction for breeding birds, we would ask that in order to maintain its attractiveness to wetland wildlife threatened by a progressive loss of suitable habitat in Ontario, that the owners of the proposed campground restrict their patrons from entering the East Marsh from their property and respect the delineated PSW boundary. This restriction would be fulfilled by a fence between the 2 properties. We are concerned that too many visitors entering the East Marsh directly from the campground will disturb the special species that make the East Marsh their home. The main entrance to the marsh is used by all current visitors, where they can become aware of the layout of the marsh and its many facilities, including the nearby visitor center. There are also concerns during the bird breeding season that excessive noise from campers will disturb the birds and their young. Smoke from campfires would also affect air quality and even flight patterns for birds in the East Marsh. We would ask that conditions to control these problems be included. We understand that the maintenance crew for a campground will always keep the grounds well groomed, but we hope that the crew would be shown the boundaries of the PSW and not be allowed to encroach on its unique vegetation. If the owners would like conservators to help them plan signs or brochures to educate their patrons about the marsh and its inhabitants, we would be pleased to help. We believe that the owners might find that ecotourism is one of the fastest growing types of tourism in the world, and advertising Cooper Marsh can be an advantage to their business. We believe that ecotourists would be much more sensitive to the values of the marsh. We would also like to remind the township that Cooper Marsh has been a destination for families in Eastern Ontario and Quebec for many years and of much benefit to local businesses. The Cooper Marsh Conservators welcome neighbors who will enjoy Cooper Marsh and help preserve it for generations to come. That is my submission, and I have 2 questions. One is concerning the idea that the MOE is sewage. In the presentation it said sewage would be pumped from each site, and I'm surprised that when it said that each site would have hydro and water, that it did not indicate that there must be a septic tank that is going to be pumped, where the sewage is going to be pumped from, unless I'm misunderstanding something there. So that's the first question. And the second question is, it looks like if they're asking for relief from the 30-meter wetland setback, that they're going to have have the sites backing up right to the very edge of the grassed area and therefore the boundary of the provincially significant wetland. And I think that would indicate that a fence is going to be very much needed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Jennifer, maybe did you want to try and answer those questions in regards to the septic and the 30-meter setback, I guess it was?
Yes, thank you. And through you, thank you, Ms. Kennedy, for your feedback and also for offering to assist with preparing sort of signage and literature for users of the campground. I think there's a very good chance we'll, in consultation with the Conservation Authority and our ecologists, take you up on that offer, because I think that will be a big part of mitigating potential impacts of this use. So in terms of site servicing, water and hydro are fairly straightforward services for each of these sites. There will be it's anticipated there will be a small trench alongside the new gravel road that will include a water line and hydro that will service each site, providing an individual septic system for each individual site, which I would point out, these sites are pads. There may be 25 by 35 foot gravel pads. And a full septic system for each individual campsite is, I think, not practical and also environmentally not a good idea, and probably something that MOE also would not support, as well as other approval authorities. Instead, a communal septic system further away from the water, further away from the PSW is being proposed, all in one spot, all approved and contained in one location by MOE. So we can avoid any sewage treatment in proximity of the provincially significant wetland, as well as the St. Lawrence River. And then in terms of setbacks from the PSW, you're absolutely right. They're quite minimal. These sites will be, most of them, directly abutting that boundary delineation. We are looking at integrating, maybe a minimum setback there to provide a bit of a buffer and a bit of breathing room, so to speak, so that we don't actually have campsite activity directly abutting the boundary. I think your recommendation for a fence is something that we need to look at and take back, discuss with the Conservation Authority and our ecologists, just to confirm that it is something that both from an environmental perspective makes sense, and also just from a sort of a planning perspective as well, and whether we visually in this rural waterfront area want that extensive of fencing. Maybe it needs to be not necessarily a wood privacy fence, but something else. So thank you for that feedback. And I think we will take that back. And I think that is a bit more of a site plan consideration, but thank you for raising it now. And we will look at that for sure.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. Elaine, did you have any more questions or comments that you wanted to make?
No, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other comments or questions from any members of the public? I'm not seeing any other questions or comments from anyone. Oh, we have one, Janet Keefe, I believe. Janet, if you're on, you can go ahead.
Janet, if you're speaking, we can't hear you.
No, she's trying to bring her back through Zoom.
Oh, okay, thank you.
I apologize. I lost my Wi-Fi. Please go ahead, Ms. Keefe.
Oh, was I muted that entire time? Oh, I apologize.
No, yeah, if you can start over, please. I think there was an issue with the Wi-Fi, so if you can just start over, if you would.
Certainly, I would like to endorse what Elaine Kennedy has said, but also add the importance of the breeding ground, which is immediately adjacent to the proposed campsite. This is where rare birds have been seen and are known to nest, including an endangered species. They use this part of the marsh because it's quiet and relatively unvisited. So the impact of a campsite on this breeding site would be significant. And also I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that there are many campsites in Eastern Ontario. There is much housing along the river, but there's only one marsh. And our marsh is valuable for the local community, for birders from Ontario and beyond. It's a provincially significant wetland site, and it's the only one we have. And I think council needs to take into consideration very carefully the needs of the conservation area, and particularly this important breeding ground, while they're considering the viability of a campsite right next door. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mrs. Keefe, for your comments. I'll make sure that the owners and the firm, Jennifer's already heard them. So is there any other questions or comments from any members of the public? Not seeing none. Is there any other questions or comments from members of council? Not seeing none. Mrs. Haley, any additional?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I would just like to thank everyone who participated. Also thank everyone who provided me their very detailed written comments to date, and remind the members of the public that you still have until August 21st at 4 p.m. to provide additional comments regarding this proposed zoning amendment. So thank you, everyone.
Okay, thanks very much, everyone. So the meeting will be adjourned, and we'll be back at 7 p.m. for a regular council meeting. Thank you.